Yeah, the lights are...
I'm loud all of a sudden. The skills we're going to talk about are tech agnostic. Like, it's not about, I need Kafka, I need Kubernetes, I need Terraform, I'm going to code in Go, I'm going to code in JavaScript. It's the kind of skills that you need regardless of what they are. And that's really challenging because what the industry looks for is, I know JavaScript, I have experience. The way that I describe this is it's as if we buy a car by going to the car dealership and saying, I need a car that drives only on the roads I've already drive on. Like, we don't actually hire people by figuring out, do you know how to figure out the next thing we're gonna have to learn? And I don't know how many people use the same coding language or the same tools that they did 10 years ago. 1, 2, 5 years ago? 1, 2, 3, 3 years ago? A little more? How many people are doing, are pushing to production something different than they did a year ago? Yeah, see, that's the winner. And so if I whiteboard tested you on the skill that you had 5 years ago, what good would that do me now? Right, so
that's precisely why I'm going to love your talk, because it's technology agnostic, because really, I'm fed up with technology and just for the sake of technology. And I feel like I need to understand more about what are the types of skills do I really need, so that technology will come secondly, and then it will just enable and support what I'm really trying to achieve, actually. So once again, thank you for joining Code Camp, traveling from the United States of America. Actually, woo! Yep. You've got the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That was a great question, too. We can just skip right into now to our talk. So as he says, I'm from New York, and the picture that was up of me before here was the end of February 2020, the last time that I got to wear the fancy headset, the last time I got to wear my fancy shoes today, last time I wore any fancy shoes. I've been in slippers for 2 years. So this is the first time that I've left the house. How many, for you, is this the first conference you've been to since that? Yeah. So isn't it awesome? I'm so glad we get to be together today. Like, it's just really exciting to be in the same room. So we'll have a talk, too, but mostly I'm going to enjoy the fact that there are other people here to talk to and interact with, and I get to wear my fancy shoes. Yeah. So, does it? I am pressing the button, but it does not go.
Is it the green button? Or
it's the green button, and the little light's going.
Okay, so maybe you have to enable it with the...
You're going to take my notes away from me?
No.
Oh, okay. No, I'm going to touch it so that I can see. I'm too jet-lagged to try and improv. Yeah, I need just the little tiny hints of what's coming next. So I'm mostly on social media. I hang out on Twitter, and I know. I might have to rethink that. But in fact, there's a great community that tweets with me, that talks about all of these wonderful things. And so join in. It would be great to connect. You can reach me also at my email address. And I am founder of Mentrix Group, and we do knowledge and information systems architecture and engineering. So I called this talk From Software to Systems, but those things mean a lot of different things. Like, I love the question, what is microservices software? Like, how do we define software? And how do we define a system? So I'm going to explain my experience, because that's where I'm defining things from. But in fact, we could do this again and describe them very differently and probably still come to the same conclusions. So I started my career as a software engineer. I was a back-end developer or a full-stack developer. Do you remember when full-stack was a thing it was actually possible to be, when that was like a concept that you could actually do? And I mostly worked on big websites, like presence, an internet presence with a lot of traffic, but not exclusively, but it was predominantly coding for information systems. And what we did was we used a single piece of software and we wrote a lot of code. We extended and extended and extended and extended, and to make it performant, we added a lot of caching. And the software itself created the boundary of space-time, right? So we created a digital space. There were lots of discussions about aggregating information versus encouraging traffic, and encouraging traffic always won, right? At the time, you wanted everyone to come over to your house. And time was request. There would be a request for a piece of information, and the software would provide it. And the tricky part, though, is that every one of these pieces of software was part of an emerging information system, right? So the internet is the information system, right? It's a giant knowledge graph. And then it's expanded to be beyond even what we would consider the boundaries of the internet. And so my clients were quickly outgrowing pretty much everything we knew to do. So one example is The Economist. Way back when, my teammates and I in Austin worked with a team in New York and in London, and we built a web property so that what was in The Economist magazine could now be on The Economist website or The Economist digital. And within 6 years or so, that one print article had about 40 plus destinations. And not only that, they were making films and doing podcasts. They were having different types of media. And there was no infrastructure to support this. When I came in, the first thing I did when I came back again to do systems architecture for them is I tried to draw a model of the current system. And I discovered two things. One is nobody actually knew, because it was all stuck together, siloed, no one actually knew. And two, my model had a box in the middle with the word Suzanne in it, and that's because Suzanne literally cut and paste things. That was the middle of the system. That's how things got distributed, was Suzanne. I just got an email, and apparently that's still happening, but less so now, right? In a more structured way. And the other, more recently, I have been working with the Wikimedia Foundation. And so this is, to me, an iconic example. So a Wikipedia, English Wikipedia, is built and designed around a single piece of wiki software. And the original concept is the information about Albert Einstein is a web page, right? Is an HTML web page. But now we think of that content, not just Wikipedia, Wikidata, all the other projects. We think of it as ubiquitous. We want to ask our smart devices questions and get that information. And so that transition, there's a number of unique challenges, but one of them is that the community also works on the software too. So the boundaries even between information and software are very blurred. But if you're interested in the first step, you can go to enterprise.wikimedia.com, and that is basically an abstraction layer for Google and Facebook and people who are consuming this information to make knowledge graphs. So fundamentally, the last, I would say, 8 years of my career have been restructuring space-time. Right? So a space is no longer defined by a piece of software, and time is no longer defined by a page request. So we've been building asynchronous software microservices where we basically we don't transform the legacy software, we create abstraction, we start to figure out ways to iteratively move into the infrastructure that we need, event-based interactions, cloud-native platforms that talk to other cloud-native platforms, hypermedia data structures, all these things. My focus shifted to the relationships between software. Right? So my focus is less on how do I do this in this piece of software, and more, what is the relationship between software and the patterns that we need in order to make those relationships healthy and emergent. And so I became an enterprise software architect in part because I love it. I really love the pattern stuff. Like the pattern stuff is what gets me up in the morning, right? But also because I had to. Like, it was a survival choice. Like, we weren't going to be able to do what we needed to do unless we thought differently. So those are a couple of examples of some complex transformations that I've been part of, or my colleagues have been part of. I have a really strong community of people around me who are now at a whole bunch of other places, a whole bunch of big information systems trying to do the same thing, basically. And what I can tell you is that almost every initiative hits the exact same iceberg. And that iceberg is almost never, we don't have enough Kubernetes expertise. That's not what sinks the ship. What sinks the ship is we don't think in systems. That we are, the term software crisis came out 50 years ago, and we haven't resolved it. And this is that as complexity increases, our thinking and communication structures do not scale with it. And so we end up trying to do something different inside of our old mental models. And I think probably everyone has had experience enough with that to know how successful that is. And more than that, we don't think together in systems, right? Because organizations are a communication structure. They're a thinking structure that dictates how we think and communicate. And so the organizational structure tends not to change, which means that the structure of our thinking and communication doesn't change, which means that we can't build something different. So what do I mean by thinking in systems? And the first thing to start with is what linear thinking, what I don't mean. And the tricky part is that most of us don't think of linear thinking as linear thinking. When we say the word thinking, this is what comes to mind. It's so ubiquitous. It's what we're taught in school, and it also is the structure of education. Right? That we are so surrounded by linear thinking that it is, in the vast majority of cases, the default. And that is not a bad thing, because we need linear thinking to build, design, deploy, and develop software. Right? So it's not a good, bad, yes or no. Different types of thinking go together to create what we need to do, but we tend to lean very heavily in this direction. And this is, we want things to be predictable, rational, repeatable, top-down, dualistic, like in the US, Democrat or Republican, as if that's the only two possible political things you could be, right? And concerned with control. Right? The mechanisms are created in order to create control. And these are fine and workable. In the circumstances, they're fine and workable, but they don't help us design systems. Right? They don't help us to resolve challenges when there's uncertainty and complexity. And maybe you've experienced this. It's one of my favorite quotes. Someone said to me about 12 years ago that Agile was invented because reality refuses to bow down to power. So we also expect predictable, top-down, rational from our socio-technical systems. We expect people to behave this way and communicate this way. So nonlinear thinking, by this I mean many things, right? So systems thinking, except that systems thinking means something different in academia than it does if you're getting an MBA, than it does in other circles. It's becoming differently enough defined that we'd kind of get stuck in those differences. Also parallel thinking and the work of Edward de Bono. If you read The Fifth Discipline, which is about learning organizations, yeah, that's nonlinear thinking too. There's so much overlap in how people are trying to describe it, because it's not one thing, that I've defaulted to nonlinear thinking and encapsulating pattern recognition. That's a big part of nonlinear thinking. And the thing that I most want, if there's only one word this whole talk that you hear today, it's practice. Nonlinear thinking is a practice. It's something that you practice, and the better you get at it, the more complexity you're going to want to take on, and then you're going to have to practice more. So if you're lucky, you actually never arrive at expertise because you're always increasing your capability and your capacity to be able to solve problems without over-reliance on linear approaches. So it is making sound decisions while happily immersed in complexity and uncertainty. So without needing to oversimplify or make concrete too soon. If I had $1 for every time someone said the word concrete to me, I could retire, right? And concrete is a very important thing, but you need to be very careful where you pour it, right? What I'll say is that, okay, so if I come to you buy a piece of property, and I'll come over and I'll just randomly pick a place to pour concrete, and that's where the house will go, people would not be for that. But in discussions about architecture, it's interesting how often concrete is wanted right up front. So you notice too, there's no Kafka Kubernetes on this chart, because to a great extent, what I'm finding is that as the different patterns emerge and as we use different tool sets, we still keep relying on similar ways of constructing thinking and communication in order to solve the problem. So nonlinear thinking is concerned with how relationships produce effect. So it's I have this and I have that. When I put them together, I get a third thing that neither of those two could have done on their own. And it's a real challenge in the transition from software to systems, where you have this and that, and there's not a lot of attention put on the and part, right? But the and part, so in listening to Holly's talk, I was actually confused, because when I think of microservices, isn't it harder to couple them and release them together than it would be to release them? I mean, it has its own repository, and it has its own... So, in fact, I think we're overcomplicating because we're not good at the and, right? At the relationship between the parts. So here's the most challenging part of my job. And I doubt that I'm alone with this. And the most challenging part of my job is that it often feels like everything is working against me. Like no one is paying attention, and everything is working against me, and the gravity is always pulling in the wrong direction. And if you feel like that, it's because it's true. Systems are counterintuitive. So when you're solving a problem outside of sort of the linear construct, what you'll discover is that what we think, what we know, is almost always incorrect, is not correct, is not going to serve us. And so I love this quote by Jay Forrester, an early well-known system scientist, who talks about that he would go into an organization and do an analysis. And he's looking for the leverage point, the place in the system where you're not paying attention to symptoms. You actually can make a change and unlock the capability or improve the health of the system. And it's hard to find that leverage point. But his experience was often when he finds it, people already know. If you ask all the engineers, and they're like, oh yeah, that's our pain point. But they're almost always doing the exact wrong thing, pushing it in the exact wrong direction. And that's because of counterintuitiveness. And then the even sadder news is, according to Danilo Meadows and my whole entire life, is that when you do find the leverage point, almost nobody will believe you. And so my experience has been that it can often take a year of talking about ways we might transform before I start being in meetings or getting emails back that have my words in them. And in the beginning, it's over my dead body, no way, what are you even talking about? You're too corporate. What are you even thinking? And that actually is not always a bad sign, but it is a challenge because I don't know that I'm right. So it's a process that requires a lot of internal integrity, which we'll talk about, that I didn't need when my focus was exclusively software. It was a lot easier. The feedback loop in software was so much shorter. The code review, it works in production. I mean, I took down production once because I feel like that's a rite of passage. But generally speaking, right, the feedback loop was a lot shorter. So why do we bother? Like, why am I here talking to you about not Kafka, right, specifically? And that's because Conway is right, that and this kind of makes sense to me, too. So he talks about that the structure of communication in an organization is the system that that will be designed. But you must have seen this. Show me a code base, and I can tell you a lot about the team's siloed, how are they working, right? You can see it in the outcome. But this makes sense because what we think and what we think together and talk about is exactly what we'll build. It doesn't come from anywhere else. That's it. Everything that's in code is just thoughts and discussions. So if we want to build something different, then we would have to change the structure of our thinking and communication. So the challenge is that we have two blockers, and they're pretty big blockers. And the first is that we are spectacularly terrible at nonlinear thinking, that we are so tangled in our cognitive biases, logical fallacies. Read up a little on logical fallacies and try to catch yourself for a week or a month in it. It's really humbling to discover how often that happens. And we really have to practice to be untangled. And the second thing is we don't know that we're spectacularly terrible at it. As a matter of fact, the worse we are at nonlinear thinking, the more we're sure we're excellent. And here's the paradox. In order to know that you're not doing well in nonlinear thinking, you have to actually be good at nonlinear thinking to see it. Right? So fortunately, though, as Carl Jung says, that only paradox comes anywhere near comprehension to the fullness of life. So in the fullness of systems, we are open to and embrace skills that we call soft skills, which is always interesting to me because they're harder. Or at least for me, I find them harder. Or as complexity increases, I find them harder. So that we can see when we're stuck. So I'm going to suggest 6 skills, and for each skill, a couple of practices. But these are really doorways, right? Pick any doorway that interests you or any combination of doorways, like it's a buffet. They really all go together. They're not really inseparable, so it kind of doesn't matter where you start. Anywhere you go, you're going to discover the interrelationship with the others. So the first is craft conceptual integrity. And this is actually more of an intention than a skill, kind of a North Star. But it's a good mantra to have when it's so easy. I was once in an architecture meeting and they were debating, 2 other architects were debating Kubernetes, yes, Kubernetes, no Kubernetes, yes, Kubernetes. And I said, why? Why Kubernetes? And one of them said, because we don't have Kubernetes. Nope, yay, logical fallacy found. Like, that's not why. But it's so easy. I'm not even making fun. I get caught that way all the time. So this question of, are we intending to create conceptual integrity? And Fred Brooks says it's the most important consideration in systems design. And he also doesn't do a great job of defining it. And it's really hard to define because it's like art. You sort of know it when you experience it, or you know it when it's missing, kind of thing. The way I like to describe it, though, is creating harmony from a cacophony of many good but independent and uncoordinated ideas. Every code base I've ever looked at, I would describe that way, right? Many good but independent and uncoordinated ideas trying to learn to play nice to each other. And that problem increases as complexity increases. So I have 3 suggestions of practices that can help raise your sensitivity to whether or not conceptual integrity is something that's part of what you're trying to do. And so the first is to think cross-functionally, right? What's the impact, or what are the relationships? What are the other perspectives, right? What's the why of what you're doing? And this is a really light touch. I don't mean, write a thesis for every JIRA ticket, but at the same time, to practice thinking outside the boundary of engineer experience, for example. And my great example of this is that, so the beginning of the Economist transformation, my team and I worked for 6 months to elaborate, because we had to pull out the whole system, and that they'd been editing on for 20 years, which is why. That's it. In digital years, that's like 700 or 800 years. And I needed millions of dollars. And so if I can't explain to the accountant why this matters, technologically, why this matters, then I'm not going to get the money, and it really doesn't matter that I actually know what I'm going to do in terms of design, right? So that stretching to think cross-functionally about what's being delivered. And the second is learning about non-tech systems. So I don't know. I know this is at least the second time you've seen this book today. So because every architect I know is like, oh my God, a pattern language. And what I like about this is that you think about components and spaces, but not in terms of microservices, right? In terms of literal space. I also moved a bunch of things around my house according to the patterns he recommended, and it was so much better. So that really convinced me even more. This is one of my favorite books in the last few years, and it is written by architects of buildings. Architects are people who teach architecture. I have so many highlights in this book that are totally relevant, and I quote it a lot in tech talks. There's a lot of overlap. And then the last is that everybody please read this book. This was last time I spoke in February of 2020. It was the speaker gift at the speaker dinner, like this. But it was amusing because we all have it on audio and printed and digital, and everybody has it. It helps create a language for talking about system patterns that move us a bit outside talking about what topics in Kafka we're designing, which is also important. But we have a language for that. So the other is study relevant to you patterns. So this is my secret favorite one. And I wish I could just give a talk on this because this is the juicy bit. This is like why we do this. But unfortunately, this one piece doesn't help us much without the other practices. So for me, this is things like decomposition, observability, testing, messaging, event-based interactions. CQRS is really big for me because everything has been both edited and read in the same piece of software, which is very interesting when you have very high traffic reads. So basically all the other talks here, right? Every time we go and learn about the patterns that are specific to us, this is a real benefit to our being able to discern when we're engaging in systems talk. So the second one is cultivate self-awareness. And it's interesting because this is that's so woo-woo. What does that have to do? What? No, she's gone woo-woo here to do this. And it's interesting to me because here's the thing. You can't improve your thinking and experience if you're not aware of your thinking and experience, right? That the ability to work with our own minds is an essential tool for what we do, right? In order to create conceptual integrity in the world, we have to create conceptual integrity in ourselves. And maybe I'm terrible at it, but I find it a tremendous amount of work, right? It's very confusing to be interacting with everybody's thoughts and opinions all the time. It's very hard to hear my own in the cacophony of many good but uncoordinated ideas. And so what we think is what we'll communicate, and then what we communicate is what we build. So to some extent, transformation is a transformation from the inside out, right? And so linear thinking says that it's a transformation from the outside in, right? Power and control. But my experience is more that teams that have these skills that we're talking about today have been, in my very small part of the world, the most successful teams. The ability to do complexity, and they're very agile in the way that they work, and the teams that aren't, we get stuck very quickly. So it gives me some confidence. So the first skill I'm going to suggest is journaling. Again, I know, a little bit woo-woo, but I get up every morning before dawn, make coffee, and I write for an hour. And you do not have to do that. Like, you could do 10 minutes and not during the day. But I actually don't really stay aware of what I'm thinking about all the things that I'm experiencing unless I take that time. The thing I'm also learning to do, which is probably even more important to recommend, and I can do it because I'm never in the room with other people now, is I write down what I'm thinking in meetings. And that includes, that was the shittiest thing I ever heard in my whole fucking life, right? Like, because I was very used to being in social situations and losing track of what I was actually thinking. And so I'm experimenting with writing it down. I don't need to do anything with it. It just helps me stay aware of, and we'll talk about why this matters, of my reactions. And the second one is meditation in any form. And I'm not going to spend time here. There's so many different ways of doing this. And I think gardening, pulling weeds is a form of meditation. Certainly any physical activities like Tai Chi. There's sitting on the cushion, paying attention to your thoughts and discovering that your mind is a 4-year-old and that if you don't give it something to do, it goes and finds something to do. And it's often not something you would want it to go and do. And this is a really good awareness to cultivate for the skill we're going to get to. The other thing is that these practices help you hear your intuition. And one of the things about systems that for me is different from software is how often I have a sense of something. I know there's a problem. I know something, but I don't have the words yet. The cognitive understanding doesn't come until after my little monkey symbol's inner sense of wrongness comes. And so as Einstein says, right, that he sometimes feels he's right and do not know that I'm right. And although we do need to be able to then convey our thinking, and so other people can share it, we want to be able to hear that sense that something about the ands or the patterns isn't jiving. And so this brings us to responding rather than reacting. So, has anyone heard of the beer game? Has anyone played the beer game? No, it sounds like a fun game. You have a couple, yeah, good. Sounds like a fun game. It's probably, when I explain it, a little less fun. But it's, I think it was MIT Sloan that came up with it, actually, but I'm not sure where the origin was. But people, major CEOs of major brands have played it, and students have played it. And so we do this. You're the brewery, so you're going to make the beer. And you are the distributor, sorry. You're going to be the middle people. And everyone on the outside, then, is the retailer, right? You're going to sell to the public. And we have a very straightforward system that comes along. When you get your delivery, you hand to your delivery person. So the distributor knows, I'll take 4 more cases next time, right? And then that's what goes. They have a way to do this at brewery. So what happens is a singer has a beer, puts the beer in a video. So suddenly everybody 22 years old in the country wants to drink this beer. So the retailers suddenly can sell twice as much. Go. So everyone goes week by week, and they do the behaviors that they think is right, and it almost always crashes the entire system and ends up with giant piles of undrunk beer. And so it's a really interesting experiment, because there are so many different factors really that come into play, but the biggest one is that people panic. They overreact from their own perspective, right? So the brewery and the retailers are not talking. There's no information shared between them, right? It goes through the distributor, and the retailers just keep ordering more and more beer that's going to take longer and longer, which the distributor then is also adding to that reaction, and then the brewery is also trying to add to that reaction, and the whole thing falls apart. Whereas if there was a systems view of what was happening, in fact, it was possible to meet the demand in a relatively straightforward way. So what we learned from the beer game, I'm sure you won't have experienced this. There's a lot of blame in systems. There's a lot of blame. Blame. And the problem is, remember counterintuitiveness? What we're blaming is almost always wrong. I could ask you, and I bet most of you can tell me what sucks about your job right now and why. Who is responsible? And although there would absolutely be truth to that, and we can have a beer and I would high five because I've been there and I totally get it, it's also probably not where the real pain in the system is, right? We probably have to go deeper to find that. So I have this speaking of counterintuitive suggestion, and that is that when you're reacting, when you're in a meeting and someone says something really stupid that really gets your, going, that the worst thing you can do is react, because you will almost always push it in the wrong direction. And in fact, so I have this with how many times have I sat with a bug, and it's later and later and later and later, and I'm trying to debug, and then I go for a walk, or I eat a piece of pizza, or whatever, and I come back and go, oh, there it is, right? Or I sleep on it. Same thing at a higher level to reacting to other people's thinking, or reacting to confusion around what's happening in the system, or how to focus on the and. And so this is going for a walk, go for a run, swimming, singing, hobbies, throwing a frisbee to your dog, anything that, because the pattern, you can't think your way out of reacting. You're just adding more to the thoughts. Your thoughts are reacting, and then you're feeding it. And who's done that? I can leave a meeting and oh, he's such an asshole. And then 20 minutes later, not only is he an asshole, but he's the biggest problem I've ever done in my whole entire life, and suddenly I have this major drama. And because I'm just feeding it. So dropping out of the pattern with experience is the first step to not reacting and enabling your ability to respond. And the second, and this is honestly the most important, if I were given one wish, one wish that I could create in the tech culture, this would probably be the one I pick, although I'm a big it depends person, so I would hate to just pick one, but this would definitely vie for it. And that's yes and. So yes and is an improv practice. So when improvisational comedians, before they go on stage, they will almost always warm up with the yes exercise. And you see this when they're on stage. So if I'm doing improv and I have a partner here, and the partner says, "Ooh, a cat." If I'm my typical engineer architect self, my first response is no, or wrong, or some version of no wrong, because no wrong is my natural way of interacting with the world, right? No wrong, resistance. Well, if you do that in improv, no wrong, the whole scene falls apart. It does not work, and it would not be fun for you to watch that. So you train yourself when the person says a cat, instead of saying, "Cats don't scale," or whatever, "It's a dog," or that's not the relevant thing. I say, "A cat. Oh, and it's got a big mane and a big, oh, it's a lion, run," like something. I'm not agreeing, I'm acknowledging. And if we could change one pattern, that we acknowledged what other people said before we tell them they're wrong, and that there's a way we'll talk about doing it, we would change a lot of the way that discourse comes to solutions for problems. It's a really big and difficult habit, and it really makes a difference. And the reason I'm overemphasizing is it's so hard. I dare you to try it for a week and see what happens, because it's a lot harder than it sounds like. And the last is try something. So doubt. Doubt is the experience of uncertainty. Anytime we're faced with uncertainty, we experience doubt. Now, sometimes that's good, doubt. Like, I'm handed a meal that's probably too spicy for me, and I don't think I'm going to like it. But we experience doubt regardless of whether it's healthy doubt or not. And the doubt is just like the reaction. You cannot talk yourself or other people out of doubt. Someone doubts what I'm saying, I do this all the time. I say more. If I tell them more, I give them more information. And it never works, but I do it all the time, right? That doubt is the experience of uncertainty, and doubt only changes when you have a different experience. So try something. What can you try in, not random willy-nilly, like let's just, go, everybody build their own thing and see whose is better. I do mean a constructed and structured try, but that recognizing that when you're really stuck, it often means that you actually need some experience in order to continue having the conversation, right? So Cope talking about the ways of doing, say, 3 things at once that eventually will help you to discern where you want to go is a great example of using this pattern where you don't know, so you structure trying, but you don't marry it. You go on a date. You don't commit forever to what it is that you're going to try. So I said respond rather than react, but I only talked about reacting. So responding is work. So responding, the way that I describe it, I call it systemic reasoning. It's also argumentation, which I don't use that word anymore because everybody thinks arguing, and we all do more than enough of that, for sure. My son is a microservices architect, and it was great because raising my son was training for my whole rest of my career, and especially in how we resolved arguments to argumentation, right? So this is very, very different. We are an opinion-sharing culture, and I've worked in organizations where I call it drive-by opinion engineering. You post something in a forum or somewhere, and then everybody gives you their opinion, and somehow you're supposed to make some integrated sense out of that. I just feel like I get punched in the face, and then I push something to production, and then I punched in the face again and get pushed into production. I don't find it very productive, the opinions, but also opinions are not how we're contributing value. It's great to have them, but that's actually not knowledge work. So the deeper work comes from using the ability to respond as the ability to arrive at the best possible conclusion under the circumstances when conditions are uncertain. What do I mean by best possible? I don't know. That's what you'd also have to define. And what do I mean by under the circumstances? I don't know. You'd also have to define that by saying, here are the circumstances that as we understand them, here's what is best in this situation as we understand it, and then using this as a method of inquiry, building your response. So every time you leave a meeting reacting, the next step is, okay, how do I now build a response to what it is that I'm hearing, which is not just shouting out your opinion. And we say when conditions are uncertain, and conditions and systems are always uncertain, right? It's a wonderful bit of delusion that we have, that we can actually make things certain. But also in systems, we want emergence often, not always, but we'll get it whether we want it or not. And by this I mean you put a relationship between three things together, and you put them in the world, and then you get something you did not design for. Now that might be a really good thing, right? Innovation. And it might be hacking Facebook, right? As a part of an election cycle. There's all ways that systems will do things. Systems will surprise you. That is pretty much a given. And so again, with this ability to tolerate and engage uncertainty. So you build systemic reasoning in a very straightforward way. Whenever you make a claim, graphs don't scale, because this is one that's got shouted at me a few times. That looks like a graph, and graphs don't scale. Okay, 3 reasons why. 3 to 5 reasons. What convinced you that graphs don't scale? Help me make up my mind. Show me what your reasons are. And then strengthen them. And you strengthen them in a few ways. First of all, is it true? Like I've said, I've made a comment about something in a technology tool only to discover it's obsolete like a month ago. It doesn't do that way anymore, right? So do I need to do some verification? Do my reasons follow that if I say, here's my claim, reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, and therefore makes sense, right? Hangs together. When you practice with this, you will discover how you don't have cohesion and inference like you think you do. If you have to open Miro and make your reasons, you'll often find gaps between them. Inference is really hard. And if inference is really hard in us being able to make a recommendation, imagine if you built it into the system without cohesion, what would happen? Right? So again, our own work is the first step towards conceptual integrity. And also you need to say why it's matterful in your circumstance. Why should I pay attention to this now? Given all of the systems concerns I have, why does this one matter? Why does this one matter today? You need an answer for that as part of your reasoning. And also, is it sufficient? So if I've only looked at it from an engineering perspective, I probably have not considered it deeply enough. What other perspectives do I also need in order to be sound in my claim? And so I am about out of time, which was interesting because this talk has been anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. I guess it just depends on how many anecdotes I want to tell when I go this. So I'm going to just go really quick for this. Make artifacts. Write it down. And they're all defeasible. I mean playing in a sandbox. Right? I mean, open up Miro and model things together anytime that you're stuck on something. And I mean keeping the why connected to the what. Even just light touch, a little link. If I want to know why this thing, your microservice, why this microservice matters, there's a little something I can look at and read and see what it is. And everybody's sharing that same understanding. And create layers in your artifact, so the CEO doesn't need the same information that the new developer does. And the way that you manage this is you make layers in your artifacts, more information, you go to another artifact. A model with details of the topics in your Kafka stream, go to a different model. Clickable layers, because your architecture is a knowledge graph, so make it like a interconnected knowledge graph. And explore frameworks. I'm just going to say, if I wanted to understand your system, if I came into your organization, I wanted to understand your system, where would I go? Because I can tell you the answer has never been here, ever in my career. Maybe you're better, have it. I've not seen it yet. So really thinking about how do you communicate your system, how do you organize artifacts so that it communicates the system as opposed to how do I develop on my local environment. So good, and in perfect time, the last one is synthesize. This is leadership and systems from my point of view. And it's only one slide. Synthesize knowledge, experience, and good judgment into decisions based on valid reasons. Not your own knowledge and experience exclusively, right? Because systems are complicated. I don't have enough tech expertise in everything anymore to know the answers to everything, and I wouldn't want to anyway. So what I do is synthesize expertise, synthesize experience, and use sound judgment in order to come to decisions. And that's very different than a manager role, yeah? Like, you don't have to have a title to be good at synthesizing. So I will skip the summary and say that I'm actually working on a book and a couple of courses. Interestingly, I'm giving a hands-on workshop at the DDD conference, so if you were at the keynote earlier and you want to learn how to kill your system, you feel free to come to that. And we do a hands-on. We're actually going to try and break apart the Wikimedia monolith into something else together using some of the ways of how we're going to communicate to figure out how to do it. So there's a subscribe there for a newsletter to get more information. Yeah? Okay, great. Good to see you. Glad we're back in the world again. Yeah.